I never planned on falling for her, my neighbor's divorced sister. But the night she whispered, "One kiss won't hurt, unless you want more," everything changed. I hadn't expected anyone new in the house next door. My neighbor had always been a quiet, predictable presence in the neighborhood, so when I stopped by one afternoon to return a borrowed tool, I was caught off guard when the door opened and someone else stood there. She wasn't just anyone. She was his sister. At first, I only noticed her poise. There was a steadiness in the way she held herself, the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from having weathered storms. She wasn't flashy or trying to be noticed, but something about her drew my eyes before I could think twice. Her hair fell softly around her shoulders, a little out of place from the breeze, and her eyes, dark and thoughtful, rested on me as if she were studying more than just the face of a stranger. "Ah, you must be the neighbor he told me about," she said, her voice smooth, touched with a wry amusement. It wasn't forced cheerfulness. It was calm, knowing, almost like she'd already decided what she thought of me and was content to let me figure it out on my own. I stepped inside, and that's when I noticed it, a faint trace of perfume, floral but subtle, like something she'd chosen for herself rather than anyone else. It clung to the air, weaving itself into memory before I could shake it off. My neighbor made introductions, mentioning casually that his sister had recently moved in for a while. Recently divorced. The word hung in the air uncomfortably, and though no one explained, I didn't need the details. There was a story in the way she carried herself, graceful, but with a touch of weariness behind her smile. We only spoke briefly, just the polite small talk you'd expect. But even in those simple words, I found myself noticing things I shouldn't, the way her laugh came softly, almost reluctant, like she hadn't used it much lately. The way her eyes shifted when silence lingered too long, as though silence had become too familiar. When I finally left that day, the image of her lingered more vividly than it should have. My neighbor's sister, elegant, guarded, beautiful in a way that wasn't loud but impossible to ignore. I didn't realize it then, but that first meeting planted something I couldn't shake. A quiet awareness. A subtle pull. The kind of spark you pretend isn't there, until it's too late to deny it. The next time I saw her, it wasn't planned. I had been outside trimming the hedge when she appeared on the porch, a mug in her hand, watching the quiet street like she was still deciding how she felt about being part of it. She caught my eye and smiled politely, then lifted her cup as though toasting the afternoon. Before long, we found ourselves talking across the low fence. The conversation was ordinary, about the weather, the neighborhood, the stubbornness of the old oak tree roots in her brother's yard, but there was nothing ordinary about the way I noticed every detail of her. She had a way of speaking that slowed everything down. She didn't rush her words. She paused often, as though giving space for silence to sit between us. But those silences weren't empty. They carried weight, like the air itself thickened with something unspoken. One day, she invited me in for coffee. The kitchen was warm with the scent of fresh grounds and faint traces of vanilla. She handed me a cup, her fingers brushing mine in the exchange. Just the lightest touch, but enough to make me notice how steady her hand was, even as something unsettled inside me. We stood side by side at the counter, talking about nothing of importance. She laughed once when I told her about the clumsy way I nearly dropped my tool bag earlier, and the sound caught me off guard. It wasn't a carefree laugh, it was softer, like something she hadn't given away freely in a long time. When she reached past me to grab a towel, her arm brushed mine, leaving behind a whisper of warmth. She didn't pull back quickly. Instead, she finished what she was doing, then looked up with a faint smile, as if testing whether I'd react. I didn't. At least, not outwardly. Inside, though, I felt it, the beginning of something fragile, something neither of us could name. Before I left, she noticed a streak of flour on my sleeve, leftover from her baking earlier. Without thinking, she reached out and dusted it off with the back of her hand. It was a small gesture, innocent enough, yet strangely intimate. My chest tightened, though I tried to cover it with a smile. That night, lying in bed, I replayed those small moments. Her smile. Her laughter. The touch of her hand against my sleeve. None of it meant anything, and yet, it felt like it meant more than either of us dared to admit. It was late one evening when the conversation between us slipped into deeper waters. I hadn't planned to stop by, but her brother was out, and she answered the door instead. She stood there with a cardigan pulled loosely around her shoulders, hair a little undone, as though the day had weighed heavily on her. "Come in," she said softly. "I could use some company." We settled in the living room, mugs of tea between us, the lamps casting a warm glow that made the space feel smaller, more personal. At first, it was simple chatter, the kind that helps pass the time. But gradually, her words slowed, her gaze wandered, and the pauses between sentences grew longer. Then she said it, without looking directly at me. "You know, it's strange, starting over like this. After the divorce, I thought I'd feel free. But most days, I just feel misplaced." Her voice didn't waver, but there was a quiet ache underneath it, the kind you could only hear if you were listening closely. I didn't know what to say at first. Words felt too clumsy, too thin to hold the weight of what she carried. So I just let her speak. She told me about the silence of empty rooms, about how the house at night seemed to echo with what used to be. She didn't linger on details, but the fragments she offered were enough to paint the outline of a loneliness I could feel pressing into the room. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand in mine, but I stopped myself. Instead, I leaned in just a little, letting her know I was present, that I wasn't going anywhere. She must have noticed. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a heartbeat too long, we just sat there in the stillness. I saw the glimmer of something, relief, maybe, or gratitude. And then she smiled. Not the polite, guarded smile I'd seen before, but a softer one, more genuine. It lit her face in a way that startled me, as if a crack had opened in her armor and a sliver of light had escaped. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For just listening." I nodded, unable to find the right words. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Because her walls had lowered, even just a little, and I knew she trusted me enough to let me see the part of her she usually kept hidden. That night, I walked home with her smile imprinted in my mind, knowing something had shifted between us, something that would be impossible to ignore. The rain came suddenly that evening, drumming against the windows with a steady rhythm that seemed to quiet the rest of the world. I had stopped by to return something her brother had borrowed, but she answered the door instead, cardigan wrapped close, a strand of hair clinging to her cheek from the damp air. "Perfect night to lose power," she said with a half-smile, motioning me inside. The lights flickered, then held, casting a soft glow over the room. Still, the storm outside made everything feel smaller, closer. She pulled a thick blanket from the couch and draped it over both of us without asking. At first, I kept to my side, sitting carefully, my hands resting on my knees. But the blanket didn't allow for much distance. Her shoulder brushed against my arm, and though it could have been nothing, I felt the warmth of her through the thin layers of fabric. We talked in low voices, about the storm, about little things, about nothing that really mattered. Yet the sound of her laugh, muffled by the blanket and the rain, settled into me like it belonged there. At one point, she leaned in a little closer to hear me better, her hair slipping forward and brushing against my cheek. The touch was feather-light, accidental, but it made my pulse quicken in a way I couldn't hide. I didn't move away, and neither did she. I glanced at her, only to find her watching me. Not with amusement, not with pity, but with a kind of steady curiosity that made it impossible to look away. There was a softness in her eyes, something unspoken but undeniably present. The minutes stretched. Her shoulder pressed against mine now, no longer by accident. I could feel the quiet warmth radiating from her, each breath she took rising and falling in rhythm with the storm outside. "Funny," she said after a long silence, her voice almost a whisper. "How a little rain makes you feel less alone." Her words hung there, delicate and fragile. I wanted to answer, to tell her I understood, but the truth lodged in my throat. All I could do was nod slowly, hoping she could read in my eyes what I couldn't say out loud. We stayed like that for a while, close enough to notice every shift of breath, every brush of fabric. The storm outside raged, but in that small living room, the only thing I felt was her, warm, steady, and impossibly near. The storm had eased by the next evening, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the streetlights. I found myself at her door again, this time with no excuse beyond wanting to see her. She let me in with a knowing smile, one that said she'd already guessed my reason. We ended up in the kitchen, talking as she leaned against the counter, her arms folded loosely. The conversation wandered, easy but charged with something underneath, like both of us were circling around words we hadn't found the courage to say. Then, out of nowhere, she tilted her head and gave me a look that was both playful and daring. "You know," she said, voice low, "one kiss won't hurt, unless you want more." I froze, unsure if she was teasing or testing me. Her eyes didn't waver, though. They stayed fixed on mine, steady but softened by something that felt dangerously close to invitation. I laughed nervously, trying to ease the weight of the moment. "That sounds like a trap," I managed, though my voice betrayed more truth than humor. "Maybe it is," she whispered, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it pulsed with tension, the kind that leaves no room to hide. My heart thudded hard enough I was sure she could hear it. She didn't move closer, but she didn't step back either. Instead, she waited, giving me the choice. Slowly, as though even the air between us could break, I leaned in. The world narrowed until there was nothing but the curve of her mouth, the warmth of her breath brushing against mine. And then, finally, her lips met mine. It wasn't rushed or demanding. It was soft, almost hesitant, like testing the edge of something we both knew could never be taken back. Her lips lingered against mine just long enough to steal my breath, just long enough to leave me aching when she pulled away. She laughed then, a quiet, shaky sound that betrayed nerves beneath her composure. "See," she said, her voice unsteady. "One kiss. Harmless." But the way her hand still rested lightly against my wrist, the way her eyes lingered on my lips, told a different story. Harmless was the last thing it felt like. I swallowed hard, unsure whether to move closer again or to step away before I lost myself. The air between us was thick, charged, as though the kiss had opened a door neither of us could shut. And in the silence that followed, I knew nothing between us would ever feel the same again. The moment after the kiss hung between us like the echo of thunder after a storm, lingering, impossible to ignore. She was the first to break it, pulling back just slightly, her hand slipping away from my wrist as if she had suddenly remembered the weight of what she'd done. Her laugh came soft, almost forced. "That was a mistake," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her words were light, but her eyes betrayed her, there was no ease in them, only hesitation, only a nervous glimmer she couldn't quite hide. I wanted to tell her it hadn't felt like a mistake. That the kiss had been the most honest thing I'd felt in a long time. But something in her expression stopped me. She wasn't ready to hear it, not now. She stood, moving across the room under the pretense of straightening things that didn't need straightening. "It's late," she said softly, her back to me. "We should just forget it happened." But the way her voice wavered on the last word told me she didn't believe it herself. I sat there, fighting with myself. Part of me wanted to cross the room, to take her hand again, to tell her she wasn't alone in what she felt. But the other part of me, the part that respected her, that understood the fear written in her posture, kept me rooted in place. Finally, she turned back, her arms folded tight across her chest like armor. Yet even then, her eyes betrayed her. They lingered on me a moment too long, softening despite her words. "Good night," she whispered, as if it took everything she had to say it. I stood slowly, not wanting to push her further. As I passed, her hand brushed against mine, just barely, almost like it happened by accident. But she didn't pull away right away. For a fleeting second, her fingers lingered against mine, warm and uncertain, before finally letting go. That single touch said more than all her words combined. She was torn, pushing me away with her voice, but holding on with her silence. When I stepped outside into the cool night air, the world felt sharper, heavier. The kiss, her hesitation, the way her hand had clung to mine for just a heartbeat too long, it all replayed in my mind. I knew then that we were standing on a line we couldn't pretend didn't exist. And the longer we tried to deny it, the more impossible it would become to stay on the safe side of it. The next day felt heavier than most. I went about my routine, but every small thing pulled my mind back to her, the warmth of her hand on mine, the nervous laugh after our kiss, the way her eyes had softened even as her words told me to forget. None of it felt like something you could just erase. When evening came, I found myself walking toward her house again. I told myself I was just checking in, just being neighborly, but the truth was simpler, I couldn't stay away. She opened the door, surprised but not unkind. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, hesitation, maybe even guilt, but beneath it, unmistakable relief. She stepped aside to let me in, and we sat together at the edge of the couch, silence hanging heavier than any words. Finally, she sighed, breaking it. "I shouldn't have kissed you," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know what I was thinking. I've been through so much already, and the last thing I should do is drag someone else into my mess. I shook my head, leaning closer. It didn't feel like a mess to me. Her eyes lifted, meeting mine, searching for truth. I let her see it, all the sincerity, all the unspoken feelings I tried to keep in check. For a moment, neither of us moved. The storm inside her was visible in the small tremor of her lips, in the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her cardigan. Then, with a shaky breath, she admitted what I think we both already knew. Maybe I wanted more all along. I was just too afraid to say it. This time, I didn't hesitate. I reached for her hand, wrapping it gently in mine. Her fingers were cool at first, tense, but slowly they relaxed, curling into my palm like they belonged there. The silence between us shifted. No longer heavy, but steady. Her eyes softened, filling with something fragile and luminous, and then she smiled, small, uncertain, but real. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing mine, her warmth seeping into me like a quiet promise. "I don't know where this goes," she murmured. "But I don't want to run from it anymore." I squeezed her hand, grounding us both. "Then we won't run. We'll just be here. Together." And in that simple moment, no grand declarations, no need for anything more than her hand in mine, I felt the quiet certainty that whatever came next, we had already chosen each other. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves a good slow burn romance. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to life, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.